and come back to it, but I'll touch on a few points with it. My precedent was Chapel Lomas de Cuernavaca in Mexico, and it was Felix Candela's first all hyperbolic paraboloid without any adjacent structures attached to it. So it's one hypar in its pure form. It doesn't have cuts like the other. It does have cuts in it, but not attached, being supported by other buildings. And here's a diagram of how he created that structure. He had the hypar, and he just did several slices to create the form. Here are some of my studies of that precedent, and here are some drawings from the Avery architecture of Felix Candela's drawings. And he had several entities of this, but using the straight elements to create straight line elements to create the curvature. And these are my precedents. These are my process models that I went through trying to play with the different shapes and forms. And the challenge I had from that was I didn't want to recreate what Felix Candela was doing in his other projects, where he started off with the hyperbolic paraboloid and created other forms from having the pure form from it. Anything I was trying to do to it was starting to look like everybody else's project. So I worked at it. This larger one on the bottom was actually my original cube that I was going to work from, and I wasn't happy, and I started over again. And what I ended up doing was taking his hypar grid and working another direction, and came up with this form. So these are some images of the drawings of the final model, and here's my final 16-inch model of the study of the Felix Candela's lines. And here's our site Hunter's Point. And my research was on the history of the neighborhood origins of the site. And as originally it was wetlands. And you can see here where the original shoreline was back to prehistoric times, and these evolved all the way out into the East River. And here you can see the contrast to it. My site is, I picked further down on the peninsula all the way down south, and it's this green area down here at the tip. And I took, I took elevation from my building and laid the lines out on the site and did an alignment with the sidewalks to create my programming. And what I was saying was, since we're exploring hybrids, there's these transitional elements and these emergences of different elements from them, from the straight lines, the emerges with curves. And on the site, there's all the circulation has all these bike paths and pedestrian ways that move about on the site. And I didn't want to disrupt the park too much, but I wanted to follow that same line of transition, which is something that terminology is as well in skateboarding. You have transitions, or what you're skating on, the different shapes of the surfaces, as well as emergence of what you get from a hybrid condition. Because land emerges from the water, I wanted to do the same thing with my buildings without adding more to that. So I brought my buildings and to the site, laying them out to where the massing was, and I started to build out into the water without fill. I have my buildings emerging from the water, bridging over the water, and bridging over the land. So here's some sections, a little bit out of order. This you can see in 2A, this is my educational building, which has 3 levels, where everything else is 1. And this would be the recreational center and the racquetball courts, and I have the racquetball courts mirroring what's going on the site with the larger buildings. Let me get to the drawings of the site itself. So these are, here we go. So I wanted to take the transitions from the sidewalks and the pedestrian paths and take them and create a new way where everything connects, emerging up out of the water and over the ground, and transitioning with skate parks underneath it, but leaving things so the park isn't disrupted too much. There's a little bit of disruption to the park, but by using the skate park as part of that, and also leaving the circulation from the other paths and connecting new paths to it. here we have my rec center using different elements from my cube as transition from Felix Candela's. This is the gym and locker rooms. This is another view of the racquetballs, and I've created some turn onto the roofs and the ceiling and of the building. These are my indoor classrooms, which are emerging out of the water. And then this building is also a part of that, where I've have my digital library. This is the one building I'm in that's divided into 3 floors, where there's a digital library, cafe, bookstore, and then down below is outdoor classrooms. And then I have my theater, the indoor theater. And that was my last drawing. And back into the President Bella. So that would be it. Sorry. Let me get to.
Richard, I thought it was really nice that you took us all the way back to the prehistory before all the urban elements were in place. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what that meant for your project, and also why you went into the water?
Yes. The site, and even up into modern times, although I talked about how this was in prehistoric times, back as far as the early 1800s, and also back in the 1600s when they first started to inhabit the site, the Dutch. It was marshland and wetlands, and it's a 100-year tidal floodplain. So when they started to develop in the late 1800s, they just started filling everything in between these 2 lines that you see here. And everything that exists in Hunters Point never existed. It all emerged out of the water. They just filled it in and built on top. And I just found that was interesting that they elevated the whole site 15 feet above sea level to create all this topography. And I just thought it was just very unique in that way. And I was wondering, and also the site that I picked, there's no buildings down there. And you can see in this picture down on the south end, I don't know if you can see my cursor, none of this is developed yet. I believe there is a condominium that is being developed on this corner. As far as right now, I don't have any Google images of that. I did see an advertisement for it. But like everywhere else, developing all these huge sky rises that build up, but I wanted to be able to have a vantage point out in the water and still be making reference to what was there, that it was an estuary, that there was, grasslands. And that's what's nice about the park that's there, is it actually transitions out of the water and up using these bike paths and these pedestrian ways. So I didn't feel that I wanted to rip up what was going there. So I wanted to elevate above that and also out in the water without just filling in everything. Water is kind of important, so.
Yeah, I thought the move to move out into the water was pretty interesting. Definitely, when you're looking at like climate change and sea level rise and potential flooding that can happen in New York, I thought it was an interesting move to see one of the projects actually really trying to engage with the water. So I thought that was very nice. Also, you're doing the high par on the ground floor as well as the roof, and I think that makes interesting spaces that are potentially habitable. So I thought that was pretty unique about the project. Another note, are you familiar with I think it's Pier 55 by Heatherwick Studio?
What's it called?
Pier 55, are you familiar with that project?
No.
This is, I'll put it in the chat, but it's also a project, I believe it's in New York, right? I'm not sure, but it's on the water, and basically they use these like structures that hold up a landscape on top. And then you can either walk under under these structures that are basically giant planters coming out of the water, or you can walk on top of this park. So I was also curious, I know you're preserving the park by moving into the water, but are you bringing some of that green landscape onto your project? Like maybe you can tell us a little bit about the materiality that you're using?
I haven't really thought about necessarily putting it onto my roofscapes.
Richard, hey Rich,
yes.
why don't you zoom back in onto that like site axon of your proposal, which is good, I think. It shows, the loop and there. Yeah, so I think I agree. It's a good question. Like, are you bringing the landscape out, or is this all building that you're building in the river? Um, how do you see it?
It's all building. I have been considering greenscapes on the roof. I do understand the challenges with that, as Professor Rifkin mentioned, some of the things you have to consider. I hadn't solidified if I was going to do that or not. I really wanted to work my way out from where I was disrupting the park, and I wanted to start filling in spaces in and around the skate park and those elements. For where I'd be laying in concrete, I wanted to figure where I could eliminate and carve that out and keep the greenscapes there as well. One of the sayings that some friends of mine had with their skateboarding was called "pave the wilderness," and it's more tongue in cheek, but it was something I wanted to avoid while trying to create a skate park. So I hadn't decided positively that I was going to put anything on the roofs or out in the water.
But do you see this project? I think the Heatherwick reference is actually a great one in a few ways, because it seems like this is clearly, at least the way you position the project, it's clearly in this sort of lineage of reclamation of water as part of the city. Not just something to be looked at, but and it's also where it's sitting relative to the creek. Isn't that the creek that's been undergoing so much like environmental reclamation because it was a hazardous waste site?
Yeah, Newtown.
The whole along this entire shoreline into the it comes off the river.
And so I wonder how the building. I mean, so like getting land out of it is one thing, but I think how it interacts with the water relative to some of those other kind of issues of purification, mitigation of pollutants and things like that. I think you can start to think about it in a more nuanced way relative to that original idea about just reclaiming land from the East River so that we can build on it, right? And the west side of Manhattan, I believe, is the same way. And so I think you could play around with that. And even the first kind of like ways that was done was with sort of driving piers into the East River, as this sort of baseline condition, and then building up from there. So I think there's some interesting conceptual bits that you could tie your project to.
Concern I had mentioned with the professor I thought about early on was with the development I know was a challenge, is just that it's the same thing going on here in Miami River, is they just start digging pollutant down in there. They did this when they deepened the for the lines, is it started killing off the coral reefs off of Miami Beach, outside of where the channel is, just from the pollutants that were coming up. It's not, but there is a lake. They dug it up and IOS started to happen. So the Miami River is kind of to this creek where it's just loaded, and we think it would be a great thing to do to start to dig. What you're going to dig up and what it's got to be prohibitively expensive.
There's another good reference here, which is Stephen Hall's Parallax Towers. I don't know if you guys have seen those, which are sited out in the Hudson River, actually facing New Jersey. But that's one that we looked at also. So maybe that mixed with the Heatherwick. You should put those references in your booklet, Rich. It would be great. David, I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Because this is that park that people were paving over, and Rich is actually siting this building out in the water and connecting back to it. He's not paving over it.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things about the park. Pick a side, Rich. I mean, either you're in the water or you're not. And in this case, and normally I'm all for projects that straddle that line. But in this case, just because whatever that is in the foreground there, that's got the stairs going down, those sort of monumental stairs, whatever that piece is, it's squashing a part of the park that is one of the more elegant parts of it for me. Because the thing about this park is that the edge along the river is a reconceptualization of the wetlands edge that used to exist there, right? Because this is a way of speaking to the river that's not a hard seawall, like a concrete seawall. because part of the beauty of this landscape, the park that's there, is that it is not a civil engineering response to the site, but rather an attempt to mediate between the sort of the human life that you would expect in a civic space and then the natural edge of the East River. And one of the things that your project does right there is that it does kind of like sort of squash that. So this is one case where I wish that the entirety of your project was out in the water and then just left the park alone. And in that way, what you'd be doing is reclaiming for the public more space. You'd be creating more space rather than sort of taking some of what already was public space and kind of like throwing something over the top of it. So that's one place that I have a quibble. There's two other things too that I would consider. One is that I love that you talked about the historical condition of that edge. It's one that I've been waiting for from everybody else because, and this applies to everybody in your class, the conditions at the edge of the East River are very similar to what we deal with in Miami. That anytime you have an edge between water and land, especially a crisp edge, it's the result of bioengineer or geoengineering. We create seawalls, we backfill, we create landfill. I mean, the Miami waterfront didn't get the way it is naturally. And so this is one of those opportunities that we have to really speak about that in an eloquent and even poetic way. I mean, the fact that this land is made, that it's constructed, that it's as artificial as the towers around it, that's something that ought to be a part of our design work. And so you're halfway there. I mean, you've identified that and you've spoken about it. I think the next step is to ask yourself how your architecture talks about that. Like, how does the architecture reveal the fact that this landscape is as contrived as the buildings, right? That while it's made of natural materials, it's not a natural landscape. So that would be one thing to add. And then the other one just has to do with the number of different parabolic structures that you've got there. I appreciate what you're doing, but at the same time, by having that many different parabolic structures on there, it looks like you've made a sort of like a catalog or an exhibition of Candela structures and placed them all in close proximity to each other. And as a result, you've got a series of pavilions that are jamming up against each other like a little traffic jam. And instead, what might work better is to sort of like expand on what you've got in the foreground. Whatever that thing in the foreground is, it looks like it's got 2 or 3 different programmatic uses that are all under a single roof structure. And I think that's the paradigm that you could continue, that kind of simplicity where you choose one of these structural types, repeat it a number of times, and then inhabit the space underneath it with these different programmatic elements, just using the sort of the vertical partitions as ways of differentiating between program elements. But I think that kind of simplicity would give the project greater legibility, because right now it just seems more like a collage of different structural forms.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I've been familiarizing myself this afternoon with Weissman-Friede's work there a little bit more. And maybe there's a way to think about this project as sort of completing theirs. Like there's the curvy part that comes around and then there's a bridge to nowhere just north of this. And that maybe yours is like an off-ramp that sort of off-ramp that closes the loop back to their bridge. Like to think about it like as adding to what's there rather than totally reconfiguring it. And it made me think of a project, a pier that Michael Maltzon's office did, a proposal for St. Petersburg,
Florida,
that I think could maybe be helpful because it has a lot of those qualities. Like it's got the loopy geometry that would come out, and it has like a big performance space bowl. It's not a ruled surface, but it's close enough that I think it could be sort of fit within the language that you have.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
like finish what Weissman-Friede started, or in the landscape architect.
Yeah, I think, Rich, it's a really smart thing you've identified about none of this is real terra firma. It's all produced, man-made. And, you know, like Albert asked, like call attention to it, just put it out in the river, and really question that edge, like where is the ground? I think that's a really smart move, and you made a ton of progress here, especially in the last week, man. It's impressive. So, you know, I applaud your effort and want to thank you for your hard work and sticking with it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, man. We have two more. Next up is Nicole, and then we'll finish with Hazer. Okay, Nicole, you have to here, I can unmute you. I did it. No, I can't do it. You have to I did.
There you go. Sorry.
There? Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Nicole Cabrera. So my precedent was the Bolsa de Valores by Felix Candela, which was a roof made up of two intersecting high bars that actually existed inside of another building. It wasn't a structure on its own. It was just a decorative ceiling vault. And it was demolished in the early 90s because of damage caused from an earthquake. So how I took the high part to create my cube is I separated the two high parts and then divided them and stacked them to create my cube. Then from the sections of my cube came the site. I chose the Rainbow Park because it's in between the Stephen Hall Library and the Pepsi-Cola sign. So I took the elevations of my cube and flattened it to create the site plan and used that to make a diagram of how I was going to organize the program. I divided it into two different types of programs, the physically active and then the intellectually active, with the cafe and a community garden bridging the two. And then this is how I broke down the cube to create a building, the individual pieces. So the high parts became this green wall that spirals up into the building and brings the landscape all the way to the inside. And the ground plane also rotates, creating this circular progression of the building that emphasizes the spiral of the green wall. And this is how I organized the program. And the landscape, the connections between the greenery on the ground and the green walls in the building. And then to further enforce the connection, I created these high bars that bridged the ground and the building. And then this was the resulting site plan. And then, so because of the rotating planes, some of the spaces end up being these double-heighted spaces, which is where the basketball courts are. And then these are the renderings. Since it is an existing park, I didn't want to take the greenery away from them. So instead, what would have been taken away with pavement is brought to the inside. And it creates this flow between the interior and the exterior. Let me get out to show you. And that's it.
Nicole, I want to say just really quickly, I think it's really interesting how you're dealing with the two differences on the sides of the surface. So like one side you have green, and then the other side you have a different material. And I think it makes a very interesting condition as you're flying through the video to watch how these surfaces, as they flip, they change materiality. And I don't know if there's something about it that I think is quite nice. Can you go back to some of the images?
Pause here for a second, Nicole. Isn't the Stephen Hall Library right here?
It's over here.
Oh, right. Okay. You have the same site as Diego.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's something like, I guess maybe because what that condition does, I guess for me, is that it kind of blurs the boundary between the green and the structure, because these twisting walls are also these vegetated surfaces. It makes me kind of, it's almost like an illusion where I lose the sense of where the ground starts and ends. And I think that's something kind of nice. I'm not sure if that's what you're trying to capture or not, but I find that kind of interesting.
I think that is a potentially nice part of the project. I think I think you have to look at those green surfaces, you know, like, believe me, I'm the least sort of pragmatic person maybe on the entire jury, but like, I do think you have to think a little bit about like the weirdness of growing things upside down and on these kind of surfaces, and because I think it, not for necessarily that, you know, to solve that problem, but because I think it would help kind of start to articulate those surfaces as they change orientation. And you have that sort of ruled kind of quality underlying all that stuff that I think you could tap into. And I like the extension of those. It does feel like the green is sort of emerging from the sort of discrete structures. But I think the sort of striations that you develop, because of their sort of equidistance between each other, I lose a little bit of the sort of hierarchy there if I'm going to play a game about the primacy of the green space. And so maybe you could come back and start to think about like, yes, I do need those access strands, you know, of paving to kind of move through, but maybe they're too big, or maybe some of them could modulate so that they become smaller, and you get a more subtle kind of like gradation between things that are important and things that are secondary in importance. And you could play a game between walkability and green in that way. And I think that could enhance the project.
Yeah, the thing that I was taken with was the sort of a wall dominant version of Candela. That these striations, like, even though it's about a warping surface that could probably transition from roof to wall, most of it it's sort of horizontal dominant, sort of floor or roof. And this project seems to suggest there's an alternative there that I thought was pretty cool. And even when I see it now on the site, I think the possibility of sort of starting with, I think what Clay was saying, like the striations that move through the site as a series of walls that then warp into one another, and that sort of cascade, I think, to set up a series of public spaces is what I think this project is, that it's a unique contribution to the studio. So that to me is exciting. More of a Richard Serra take on Candela.
I agree, Nicole. You know, good. I think this is the best view, like where it really comes together. I also would agree, although I was going to say this before Mark's comment, I mean, because to me, the quad that you create in the middle of the space, it remains flat. And not only flat, but not open. You have a linear path, like hedged in with trees. So it just really remains a corridor through the site. And I would question that without transforming it somewhat. Like I think if you're going to establish that path, do something with it. Otherwise, to me, that's a curious move. I know it comes from the diagram and this axis, but I think that's an axis that you could start to manipulate with topography or with these wall surfaces or horizontal topography. And to me, that's the weakest part, but that's an interesting reading on it. And you should try to clarify it the way that Mark and Clay were saying, like as a series of a vertical orientation of candela instead of a horizontal one. That's a provocative move that you solve in some ways. All right. Great. Great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
The other thing that kind of starts to point to, which I've noticed in a lot of these projects, is the sort of site planning as a sort of projection of some set of operations that existed before the site, and which I actually like that. But I think sometimes, like, my tendency would be to start to manipulate like geometry back to tailor it to the site. But like what we see here is a use of the landscape as the sort of that hybridization between building and urban condition, which I think is pretty interesting. It's not such a geometric move in a lot of these projects, but it's more about texture and land and light, which is another way to think about it.
Yeah, we read Shumi's essay about site strategies. I forget the title of it. David, maybe you remember, but where he talks about the 4 approaches, like scribbling in the margins, overlaying a historical layer, introducing an intermediate layer, a new layer, and then negotiating between the differences. And we explored a few options like that. But yeah, I see what you're saying, Clay. I think that's good. All right, Hazer, you're up.
Hi.
Get away. By the way, we'll talk after. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, my name is Hajar Abdu. For my precedent, I researched the Bacardi Visitor Pavilion in Puerto Rico. It consists of 4 repeated high pars and viewed as a perfect square from above. So when I was creating the larger cube, I took that characteristic and I placed the pavilion on the top and on the bottom and designed spaces in between. This is drawings. The site I've chosen is directly above the river. This is a closer view. I projected an elevation onto the site and repeated it to connect with the surrounded edges. I started to fit the program to the space as created and subdivided my cube into 3 sections. Here, as I placed the program, I started peeling the high parts to create an enclosed program underneath and manipulate the landscape using high parts. This is landscape and ground diagram. Circulation, enclosures. And this is my video. As you can see, I wanted to incorporate the grid used to create these high pars throughout the project to show the structural flow and the formwork. So this is the roof plan and second floor plan. This is sections, and I feel like the project is best read in section because you get to see how the ground and the high pars kind of connect the program throughout the site. And here, for example, you can see from the inside of the building, you can see that how the walls kind of are turning into the ground outside. That's it.
Great, thank you. So clarify a few things quickly, Hajer. And by the way, guys, this is our last project that we'll look at. But clarify, what is on the site where you're putting this now? Can you show it to us before?
What is on the site?
Yeah, where are you putting this and what's there now? You're building this over the water also, right?
Yes.
Can you zoom?
Yeah. And using the overlay of the elevation drawing, I kind of use that outline to create surfaces and leave. There's still a connection between the site and the river. It kind of creates these two lakes in the middle.
This is a little bit like the project that Mark mentioned earlier, the St. Petersburg Pier that Michael Maltzon did, where instead of a linear element, it goes out into the water and then it formed a loop and it actually blocked your view. So you felt like you were in a bowl and it kind of framed this round cutout of the water. I think it's interesting to construct like a loop on top of the water and frame a lake, even though it's really part of the much larger body of water. Something interesting about that. One thing I would commend you on is I liked how your animation kind of ended and opened up with a view back to Manhattan, and we could see the orientation of that. I thought that was a really nice way to do that.
Thank you.
Maybe you could click on it right there, yeah.
Yeah, I really believe this one is like let's call it a site-specific experimentation with these forms, which maybe that's good enough. But yeah, I think it seems like there's just a layer, like it's super elegant, it's beautiful. I even buy the overall logic of it, but I think there's just a layer of, like even with like the weird sort of brutalist grid overlay on everything. Sorry, my cat's fully engaged now in the review. Yeah, it seems like a kind of abstract formal exercise, which again I'm generally okay with, but it doesn't seem believable programmatically to me right now. I don't know why. There's just something about the presentation that everything seems super diagrammatic, which is maybe why I like it so much. But I think it's really well done and elegant.
Thank you.
You agree, Hajer, it's diagrammatic?
I mean, I feel like because I placed the grid all throughout the site, it gives it this diagrammatical, which I guess in this project specifically in Candela, it would make sense.
Yeah, no, but I think that's not a problem. I think what Mark is saying is we never really see the programmatic use of the space. Even the section, it's kind of stacked. I feel like it could have more sectional variety in there. But yeah, I think that's, I think that's appropriate criticism of it.
I just wanted to pick up on what Mark was saying, because I think that he's right. The project that this really reminded me of is the Olympic complex that Frei Otto designed in 1972. and where it's, you know, it's a series of these kind of fantastic tensile structures that also kind of form a grid that's hanging in the air. And they have a lot of these points as well where the masts connect to this sort of mesh that's hanging up above.
The
And
grid,
the project there that, I mean, what's amazing about them too is that that's also set in a landscape. And I think it's the part that's really underappreciated about this Friado project, because everybody looks at the tensile structure and it's always tensile, 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 tensile. But look at the landforms underneath. So basically the entire project is between a manipulated landscape underneath and then this kind of fantastic drape of this kind of tensile structure up above. And in that space is where things happen. Now the program there is really specific. You know, there's an Olympic stadium, there's a swimming and diving space, and those are all really fantastic. And I think that I think for me, that's what's missing here is that I think that the gridded structure is really fascinating. What I really like about it is that it really emphasizes the elegance of these curving hyperparabolic surfaces, right? But at the same time, that's the entirety of the project. So all of the nuances of program, and there are really specific programmatic elements in here, right? Like a library is, you know, it's a place where you got to imagine a teenage girl in between her high school classes and heading home, right? She stops at the library to read a chapter of a book. Like, what happens in that space? And it's a different kind of space than the racquetball court, right? Where somebody goes at like 6:30 in the morning to sort of like get their thoughts together before going to work. And there's like a real narrative of the lives there that's just kind of absent from this. And it creates this landscape that reminds me more of these kind of really slick international museum projects, right? Like Bilbao or Abu Dhabi or any of these places where they're building these kind of placeless, gigantic museums that have this kind of exceptional sort of site on a waterfront or something. But beyond that, they just don't really speak about the kind of wonderful specificity of the spaces inside. Anyway, that's what I'm getting at, is that I think that you could really talk about those spaces inside, that each of those, this project could be this kind of fantastic draping membrane hanging above, a canopy that shelters everything, and then very specific spaces inside for things like reading or playing sports or whatever.
I really enjoyed the two larger spaces, the ones that are almost elevated. They seemingly look like they're using these the high par to be like on stilts. I think that's really, really nice. And the spaces are super interesting and almost to the point that, I mean, the ones that are on the outside, although they make a really interesting section, it's almost like you're generating this new landscape with the high pars on the ground. I'm not even sure if you completely need them on the ground. I almost really like them. And if they are on the ground, maybe it's just the way that you're detailing them with the same structure as the building. But maybe it would look more interesting if they had a different detailing, so they looked like they were separate from the buildings. I really like those two spaces that you had. And you can go back to those two images. Yeah, these spaces in there are super nice. You had a few images of them that I thought were really successful.
Maybe it's in the video. I'm not sure.
Maybe. But yeah, I would just say that like I think for me the structure on the ones that are habitable inside, I think for me that's very successful. But then as like this grid pattern continues all the way on the landscape, I think I would like to see a little bit of a different detailing for them, or maybe if they are using that detailing, maybe they're used for some kind of purpose on the ground, like some kind of like planting system or some kind of paving system. But I think that having a difference between them maybe give it a different feel. So it's not just so like massive and covering the whole site. It has like some kind of integration into the ground.
Okay.
Yeah, the grid is, I mean, because to me, like, I mean, clearly the grid is the major sort of effective move here, and it does a lot of like work in terms of almost camouflaging spatial conditions in some ways of topology of inside and outside, which I think is super weird and kind of intriguing in so many ways. But I think some level of starting to, in a more subtle way, starting to differentiate certain things, I think would be, and that's been maybe just as a thing that I'm interested in because that's what I've said almost every time, but like how do I have the sort of continuity that's suggested by the grid and the sort of like warping surfaces that are transitioning, but then how can I start to suggest through other kinds of detailing certain degrees of specificity, and maybe that gets to the question about a program, which I think could be really interesting. The other one is when you insert these sort of flat floors inside of the bigger shell structure, which I think is totally fine. You need flatness. I think we've spoken to that, but I think you could start to think about sectionally, how could I start to deploy the HYPAR maybe in an inverted way to start to create structural conditions underneath these slabs, right? That would register a little bit of that structural logic. I don't know if that would actually work, but I suspect it could be done. And so it would start to give your section a little more sophistication and variation of thickness and sort of spatial quality as well.
I kind of tried to do that with the larger space that's enclosed. This is actually multiple HYPARs to close up the space, and kind of all the walls inside that space are HYPARs.
Mm-hmm. But I'm saying the floors.
Oh, the floors. Okay.
Yeah. So if you have this kind of structural system in the floor, but maybe it might be 7 or 8 times more dense in terms of how it distributes the load. Honestly, I don't know if that would work, but I think it would start to give at least some sensibility about like thickness on those elements,
Okay.
Yeah, great guys. I appreciate the feedback and I agree. I've always thought there was something about this project that resembled Frado is a good reference. Also, Le Corbusier's Phillips Pavilion reminds me a lot of the models for that and the lines on services. Also a tensile structure. But yeah, I agree, Hazel. You should take one more attempt at, detailing program and plan, even in section. It just appears generic now, the spaces, like flexible for any program, which is a kind of strange take given the, formal complexity of the proposal. But I like the citing of it. I think that's an interesting move, and maybe just a few more overlays of diagrammatic layering could clarify the organization of this thing. The video is good, and we understand the form and geometry. So I add a little more. I think it's a strong project if you add information and reflect on it. And I want you all to feature these in your portfolios. I think it's a great investigation to end on in your final year. And anyway, we have the master super jury starting at 4. Guys, we're not done. Clay, you are, if you want to be. But I just sent everyone something in the group chat, and Jason said, were you aware of it? I assumed you were. We give out Studio Prize awards and Alpha Rokai awards and things like that. And then one student from each studio is going to present their project. And then the super jurors are going to discuss and pick like a top master project for the year. So I think we're all going to meet one more time, but I just wanted to thank everybody. I know it's been a challenging semester. I enjoyed our time together and traveling and, gluing sticks together.
Pasta.
I learned a lot. Selfishly, I learned a lot in the studio. And often I pick these topics not because I'm an expert, but because I'm curious about them. And I really learned a lot about Candela and these geometries and the sites. And it was a fun year together. And I really appreciate your hard work. Clay, Mark, thank you for joining us. I don't know if you have any comments.
No, thanks for having me. Nice work, y'all. Good luck with everything.
Appreciate it, man.
See you.
Thank you.
All right.
So I'm leaving now, Nick, and I'm going over to that other jury.
Yeah, we'll all see you over there.
Okay.
All right.
Good job, guys.
Thanks, Mark.
See ya.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Albert, you too, man. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you sticking with us.
No problem. Great work, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Albert.
Thanks, Albert. David, you're muted. Are you talking to us?
No, I was just gonna say I didn't get invited to the other jury, I don't think, but I just so whatever. I'm just gonna go and drink some more. But I just wanted to tell you guys, congratulations, all of you. It was really an honor to be able to to do this review with you guys. And I know this is the weirdest way to end your architectural education.
Yeah, it is.
Bravo to all of you for your perseverance and everything. I mean, this is some really exceptional work. So congratulations.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. So why don't we all, we'll have a follow-up class, I think, next week. We have one more. Basically, your final remaining thing is to organize all this work. And listen, you know, I was very happy to see so much new work today that I haven't even seen a couple days ago. And I really think, you know, there's always, in every studio, there's always like 2 projects that are, you know, a little bit better than others, but consistently all the work, it really came together. I was worried about quite a few of these projects, but it really came together in the last week, and they're great projects. So I really want to personally thank all of you. The last thing to do is to organize all of your research into the booklets, and the department is gonna, you know, print these whenever we are able to look at booklets physically again. But I know we want to start archiving every master project studios. So I'll give you the format for that. I think you have it, but let's plan to meet next week one day at 2 o'clock one afternoon. We'll just go over that. And I'll help you organize the table of contents, and you could spend from now, you know, for the next 2 weeks filling it in until grades are due. Okay?
Okay.
Do you all have the link to the super jury thing? I just sent it.
Yes, I think Chandler sent it as well.
All right, just want to make sure. So maybe we, you know, take a quick beverage break and then log in over there. And Fatin, hey guys, Fatin is going to represent us and present her project. So cheer loud at the end of her presentation.
Yay.
Congratulations.
Goldenberg always wins, Fatin. Don't let him win again. You know?
I'm gonna try, you know.
That's because everybody's worried about the ocean.
Is he really? I don't think so.
I don't know about him. I think everybody else is.
No, guys, but really great work. And, you know, any number of you could have presented and it would work. So great work. Kick back, relax, enjoy the year end. Typically, we're all jammed in the MBUS gallery. So
Right.
maybe this is more comfortable anyway. But at the end of Fatin's presentation, maybe unmute your mics and like clap loudly or something.
Okay.
All right, guys. I'll see you in a little bit. See you over there.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.